it's time for Global Insight. Is Washington's trade policy still America first under Joe Biden? When South Korea's largest companies announced multi-billion-dollar investments into the United States in May as a gift for President Joe Biden during his first state visit to Seoul, they were not expecting the US leader to sign laws that would possibly cripple their sales less than 3 months later. A South Korean delegation of trade and diplomatic officials were in the US to press lawmakers to reconsider a law that cuts tax credits for foreign-made electric vehicles assembled outside North America, while reinstating credits for the most popular models produced by US carmakers GM, Ford and Stellantis. Now, Seoul and Brussels say that the move is likely to flout global trade agreements as it favours domestic companies over foreign firms in the local market. The new provisions have been disappointing for US allies that trusted Washington's new friendshoring policy and saw their firms make large-scale investments to support Biden's initiatives, including Hyundai's $10.5 billion towards new electric vehicle and battery plants that would generate thousands of American jobs. Now, we discussed the latest developments on this front and what this indicates about Washington's commitment to cooperating with its allies on economic security. For this, we have Troy Stangerin, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute, and Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea, who joins us in studio this morning. Very welcome to you, Professor Yang, and Mr. Stangerin. Thank you for joining us all the way from Washington, D.C.
Glad to be here.
Well, my first question goes to you, Mr. Stangerin. So, as much as the Inflation Reduction Act, which was recently signed into law by President Biden, is now very much law, it doesn't seem too likely that there are going to be major concessions or breakthroughs on the US side. But to what extent do you think Washington will relent?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is the most important piece of environmental legislation ever passed in the United States. It's going to take and boost electric vehicle sales and electric vehicle battery production in the U.S. But there clearly are issues in terms of the strictures put in place under the legislation. Now, we'll need to see what the regulations actually are that are put in place to take and implement this piece of legislation. But I do think it's positive that the United States has said it's open to taking and talking with South Korea about a way to try and resolve some of these issues. One thing I would point out is that right now, the United States and South Korea are essentially in a partnership to develop electric vehicles, with South Korea providing most of the batteries. If you look at the development of battery plants in the United States, about 13 of 15 that are expected to come online by 2025 are either South Korean Seoul companies or joint ventures with South Korean companies. So this is something that's very important to take and try it and work through, not just for South Korea, but for the United States' own industry. And one other thing I'd point out as well, there are going to be challenges, I think, to try and meet some of these benchmarks. The legislation does allow for minerals and components from not just the United States to be part of the products in the end, but also from Australia, Canada, Mexico, and other US FTA partners. So perhaps there'll need to be a little bit of creativity of which FTA partners can provide which parts to the South Korean plants in the United States.
Professor Yang, well, South Korea and the European Union as well, they've expressed concerns about the legality of this issue. And well, for South Korea, we have a bilateral free trade agreement with the US. So would this this new US law really flout FTA rules?
Okay, well, in the WTO agreement, in the GATT agreement, in Article 3, there is a national treatment, and that is incorporated into Korea-US bilateral FTA Article 2.2. And what that national treatment basically says is that if a good is determined to be made in Korea, then the importing country, in this case will be the United States, they cannot treat the Korean-made good differently once it pays the tariffs and passes the import procedures and goes into the U.S. national market. And then further, the importing country cannot enforce local content requirements, so they cannot force the Korean companies to have U.S. parts. Now, so this is what the GATT agreement, and because of that, the Korea-U.S. FTA determines. And so the current measures do seem like it's going against the GATT and FTA agreements. There is a big exception, which is the national security exemption. And the national security exemption was used by President Trump to prohibit imports of a wide range of goods, including steel and aluminum. The legality of that, at least for the WTO, has not been clearly established yet. So there may be a way for the United States to say this is legal, but it is in a bit of a shaky ground.
Right, and well, Seoul and Brussels, obviously they don't want to go to that extent, but they have talked about raising this at the WTO. But there is still some skepticism over how effective WTO arbitration is going to be. So do you think it's really going to impact Washington at all, or do you think it's set on creating some new world trading order?
Well, right now the WTO dispute settlement mechanism is in paralysis, and I'm sorry to say that's partially because of the United States. The way that WTO dispute settlement works, it's like a trial. You have the first stage trial and then the appeals process, but the appeal process right now is in paralysis, partially because the United States has not assigned people who can act as judges. So you may have the first case, but once it goes into appeals, the process right now is just stopped. So we cannot get a final answer on this. And in further, even if the appeals process was working, the time it takes to go through the whole trial process right now is somewhere between 3 to 5 years. So even if the trial process was working, we could not overturn this rule until maybe at the earliest 3 years from now. And even then, the importing country has the right to ignore the WTO rulings if they're willing to take the reprisals that comes with it.
Right, I see. And Mr. Stangbring, well, the Inflation Reduction Act, it also stipulates that batteries used in electric vehicles, they're going to need a certain amount of components that come from Northern America or a country that has an FTA with the US. And how do you think these new EV battery requirements are going to affect not just South Korean car makers, but all car makers in the US? Do you think they'll actually be able to meet these quite stringent standards on material composition as well as production?
It's going to be challenging. It's estimated right now that Tesla, which actually does source a decent amount of its minerals and materials from the United States, probably wouldn't actually meet the threshold. Next year, 40% of the minerals in EV batteries and 50% of the components are supposed to take and be from the United States or an FTA partner. The important deadline, though, however, is that by 2025, none of the components or minerals can come from a foreign entity of concern. Now, that's not explicitly laid out, but China is clearly going to be one of the countries that would be an entity of concern. When we look, though, at the broader market for both the minerals that go into EV batteries and components, China is an important source. Looking specifically at lithium, for example, more than 50% of the world's lithium is mined in Australia, but around 60% of the world's lithium is refined ultimately in China. And so taking and putting in place the refining facilities and the mining facilities in other countries to take and meet these types of strictures is going to be challenging. Now, Joe Manchin, who was one of the big drivers behind this legislation, has said companies need to work quickly to meet these goals, and it might be possible, but I do think there are real challenges because of China's real stranglehold both on the mining and the refining process.
And Professor Yang, well, US car makers, they're still in the early stages of developing EV batteries for themselves, and they're very much dependent on some of South Korea's components that go into EVs. So do you think that could possibly be a bargaining chip for South Korea?
Well, yes, because as Mr. Stangrone just mentioned, it is very difficult right now for even the United States makers to get all the parts and raw materials they need. Now, so Korean manufacturers can easily form at least a temporary alliance with the U.S. EV makers as well. And another component that we should probably look at is the actual support for having this kind of very stringent requirements may not be that large. Now, because the U.S. Democrats, the President Biden's party, only has 50 senators in the 100-member Senate body, they need every senator's vote. And there seemed to be just one or two senators who were behind this requirement being so strong. Other senators, they may be convinced into having some weaker requirements, but because they needed every one of the Democratic votes, they may have gone with the stricter requirements to satisfy these perhaps one or two senators. In which case, if we take a very relatively optimistic scenario, and if the Democrats get more senators during the midterm elections this year, there might actually be more support for having looser requirements than currently.
Right, as the local car industry there, they've also expressed some concerns as well. And well, Professor Yang, well, going forward though, companies, governments and allied countries, they've been a bit concerned about recent US policy movements, I suppose, with US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, her having said that friendshoring is really all about expanding or opening up US markets and giving allies or trusted partners access if they invest in the US. But then seeing President Biden sign in these laws, that could very much affect trade with these countries, for instance. Do you think that this kind of trajectory shows that it's still very much America first for the Biden administration? I
think so, and that's because of the current political situation in the United States. I'm not sure if they have a wide support for this kind of American first policy, but the proportions of the electorate and the political situation virtually forces the government and the legislature to take America first position. Now, there's about 30% of the U.S. population who are Republicans, and right now they seem to be very anti-trade, very protectionist, and that's enough to elect a president. Now, in the legislature, it's about half and half between Democrats and Republicans. The Democratic voters right now seem to favor free trade, but it's not that big important an issue for them. For the Republicans, it is a very important issue that they take protectionist views, because the previous president, President Trump, had very protectionist views, and that has been linked with the current Republican voters and Republican lawmakers. Now, on the Democratic side, as I mentioned, the Democrats, people who vote Democrat do seem to be relatively pro-trade, but they do not feel very strongly about it. But the Democratic Party has interest groups like labor unions who are very protectionist. So for both sides, it'll be very difficult to have a pro-trade agenda, and because of that, we'll probably be stuck with the American first type of U.S. policies unless the proportion of the members of Congress and voters change significantly in the next few elections.
Right, and Mr. Stangerine, well, it's been named that for months, since last year, Detroit-based trade unions labor unions and companies like Ford, GM and Stellantis, they've been lobbying lawmakers to remove the curb on companies that qualify for tax incentives, and they argue that, without the subsidies, foreign car makers are going to get ahead, and they've also raised concerns about competition with China. So it's really, they've been bringing all these issues to lawmakers. And well, is this what the future of friendshoring is going to look like?
Well, I think first, I just want to add something on the politics in the United States that Dr. Yang was talking about. And essentially, if President Trump were to be reelected, this would be a very strange situation in the United States, to where he's not necessarily a proponent of climate change, but this is the type of policy he might find himself wanting to support because it might take in further U.S. jobs. So the politics could be very fluid and strange on these types of issues in the United States over the next few years. But in terms of the future of friendshoring, I think what we're seeing with this specific piece of legislation is somewhat unique. Senator Marco Rubio, who's a Republican, has been pushing for a long time to try and get return to production and refining of minerals in the United States or within partners, to move away from the dependence from China for national security reasons. And so I think this idea of trying to take and develop legislation that would require usage here and require development here in our FTA partners is probably going to be somewhat specific to this. Now, that being said, I think the broader idea of friendshoring is that we all face challenges, and there are difficulties we've seen in the last few years in supply chains in terms of disruptions. And we've seen going back to THAAD, how China reacted when it put in formal sanctions on South Korea, what it's done with Australia and others, and that there's a need ultimately for all of us to reduce our dependence on China and to try and take and become more self-reliant with each other. And so I think, friendshoring is about trying to take and come up with more secure supply chains, not just for the United States, but for the United States friends and allies. But that being said, I wouldn't be surprised if, on things like minerals that are critical for national security, if you do see fairly, protectionist or America first type ideas put out.
I see. Well, this is where we're going to have to leave the discussion today. That was Troy Stangerin, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America, and Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.